All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Loeffler, and I'm a program coordinator for the Alaska Center for Energy and Power here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where we're actually having our first snowfall up in the hills this morning. For those of us joining for the first time today, the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, or ACEP, is an applied energy research program with a mission to develop and disseminate practical, cost-effective, and innovative energy solutions for Alaska and beyond. ACEP provides leadership in developing energy systems for islanded, non-integrated electric grids and their associated oil-based heating systems. If you're interested in learning more about ACEP, please check out our YouTube channel for more great community energy profiles. Have that open here. There's some great videos, some clips from our student internship program, or head on over to our website, which is acep.uaf.edu. Where you can also check out previous recordings of webinars from earlier this summer. If you missed them, you can find them here under knowledge sharing. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter, which is at our homepage at the very bottom. So scroll all the way down. You can enter your email address and keep up to date with future webinars, what else ACEP has going on, great projects around the state. So today's webinar presenter is Gwen Holdmann, the founder and director of ACEP. Prior to joining the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Gwen worked in the private sector as a design engineer and project manager, including the design and construction of the only operating geothermal power plant in Alaska at Chena Hot Springs. This project received several awards, including an R&D 100 award and Project of the Year in the Renewable Energy category. Before handing over to Gwen, just a few housekeeping reminders. Please hold all questions for the end of the presentation. Gwen will have about 30 minutes to present, and I'll chime in towards the end of that time with a 5-minute wrap-up reminder, leaving plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. When you leave the webinar today, please keep an eye out for a pop-up survey in your browser. Let us know how we're doing and what you'd like to see more of in the future. We are working on planning more webinar series for this winter, so keep an eye out for that announcement and let us know what you are interested in. So without further ado, Gwen, the screen is all yours.
Great. How do I share my screen? I lost the button here.
Uh-oh.
Hang on. All right. Oh, here we go. Share. All right, and I just really, want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and I'd like to reiterate what Carolyn said earlier, which is that we're really trying to understand what information that we can put together that's valuable for folks that are interested in these sorts of energy challenges that we have, especially for remote areas. And so please do fill out that survey if you have the time at the end of this, that we can kind of try to make sure that our lecture series, our webinar series here is really geared toward information that people want to use in the future. So my presentation today is on exploring and developing low temperature geothermal resources. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of geothermal energy. I know we have a lot of folks that are participating today that have a good background in geothermal energy, but I just thought I would get everyone kind of up to the same sort of level in terms of a basic understanding of geothermal, and also talk a little bit about the sort of characteristics of a geothermal resource that make it sometimes easier or better to develop compared to other geothermal resources. And then I'll talk about specific applications of geothermal energy with a specific focus on the Chena Hot Springs geothermal project, because I do have some experience with that one, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more generally in terms of some of the different applications for geothermal energy, or even low quality heat in general, and how we can take advantage of that for beneficial purposes. And then we can open it up for discussion. So, at its very most basic form, geothermal energy is just heat from the earth. And so, here I think everyone kind of understands that the center of the earth is hot compared to the surface, compared to the crust. But one thing to kind of understand is that the amount of heat that's sort of radiated outward, that's lost to the surface, is not uniformly the same at all places on the surface of the Earth. And so that's sort of important to understand. And it's also important to just understand like that really with these geothermal systems, we're very much just scratching the surface of the crust. I kind of have like a little tiny red line here on this particular illustration at the top. My pointer's not working here, but it kind of shows like that's about like maybe the very deepest well that's like ever been drilled. It's just barely, you know, barely really scratching the surface. You know, the average geothermal gradient around the world is about 15 degrees Fahrenheit per 1,000 feet, or about 25 to 30 degrees Celsius per kilometer. And that, again, is not uniform. There's places where there's a higher gradient, and those are areas that we often look at developing geothermal resources. And then there's also area where you might have thicker crust or where there's a lower gradient, where it can be more difficult to potentially tap into that deep heat in the Earth. Another really important factor when it comes to geothermal energy is understanding that heat in and of itself isn't adequate to really produce that resource in a way that you can use it for, you know, either space heating or for power generation. You need to basically use the Earth as a heat exchanger. You need to have some sort of a mechanism for transferring that heat out of the Earth in a way that then you can go ahead and use it in a power generation cycle or whatever purpose that you're trying to use it for. And so a big part of this is often having what we call a hydrologic cycle, some sort of pathways for fluid movement in the Earth where that heat can sort of be picked up, kind of creating this heat exchanger with the Earth, and then finding pathways for that fluid to migrate back up to the surface, whether that's created artificially through a well that we're drilling or potentially naturally through faults or fractures in the Earth's surface that allow us to kind of see or tap into that geothermal fluid at some sort of surface expression like a hot springs. So it's really important to understand that those are the two basic things that we need, is some sort of a path to bring heat to the surface where we can take advantage of it, and then also some sort of a heat source. High temperature, steam dominated geothermal resources have typically been some of the easiest and most productive resources that we have developed. Some good examples of that is Yellowstone, which obviously hasn't been produced because it's in a national park, but those sorts of features like geysers and things like that are sort of typical of a steam-dominated system. The second image here on the bottom right is of the Hellisheidi power plant in Iceland. Iceland is sort of in this really unique position in that they're both on a plate boundary, but so they're at a spreading center, so there's a typically thinner crust in that area, but there's also a hot spot, just like at Yellowstone, where you have magma and heat closer to the surface that's kind of due to deep circulation within the Earth. And so it's creating this area where there's unusually high temperatures relatively close to the surface and really spread over a fairly large geographic area as well, that makes Iceland a really unique place to be able to tap into very high temperature geothermal resources and take advantage of those for all kinds of different purposes. I also included Larderello, Italy, which is another dry steam field. It was really the first one that was actually ever developed for generating power from a geothermal resource back as early as I think 1904 or 1905. But we're really going to talk about sort of medium or low temperature geothermal resources in this webinar. And there's really two different mechanisms for these resources commonly. And one is just plain deep circulation into the Earth's crust. So where you have fluid pathways where water can migrate sometimes for several kilometers, several miles into the Earth's crust, pick up heat. Perhaps there's heat closer to the surface, perhaps not, but there's some way that that fluid is migrating deep into the Earth's surface and then finding a shortcut, a quick way back up to the surface. And that's one mechanism that's sort of commonplace. For those of you that are from Alaska, Southeast Alaska is an area like that where you have a lot of kind of rupturing, fractures, faults, that's allowing those open circulation pathways deep into the Earth. The other possibility is that you do have some sort of body of rock that's hotter than the surrounding rock. And Chena Hot Springs, which I'll talk about in a minute, is actually an example of that, where you actually have this higher temperature rock body that's created by, in the case of Chena Hot Springs, a granite pluton that is kind of a body of magma that sort of blobbed up from deep in the earth at one point in the past and has gradually been cooling over time. There's no original heat left from the magma, but there's also been a lot of radiogenic decay, radioactive decay of elements that are native to that particular rock body. And so often uranium and thorium that are decaying over time and creating higher temperatures than the surrounding rock. Because those are relatively high, the pluton or that rock body that's below the ground can kind of inflate a little bit, or get a little bit bigger, which creates some fractures and faults. In granite, that's often not necessarily just horizontal faults. There's often like good vertical cracking of the rock, and so that's providing these fluid pathways, and it's essentially mining heat out of a rock body that that has higher temperatures, not from original deep heat in the earth, but because there's actually radioactive decay in that rock body itself. I just thought I'd show this map. I know we have a lot of participants that are not from Alaska, but Alaska actually has many of these different types of geothermal resources. There's an interior belt that kind of goes across the middle of the state that's called the Central Alaska Hot Springs Belt. And that's where you see that most of these hot springs resources, most of these geothermal resources are located around the margins of these granite plutons that are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 90 million years old. So there's no more liquid magma or anything like that associated with them. They've solidified a long time ago, but because they're high in these radioactive elements, they create some heat that's fairly, defined in scale that can be tapped for beneficial purposes. As I mentioned before, Southeast Alaska has a lot of fractures and faults that extends into Canada as well, that you can kind of see hot springs at various places along that. And then the Aleutian Islands is an area of very high temperature geothermal, but it's quite different from Iceland, and that's actually an area of fairly thick crust with these more stratovolcanoes. So you need to get closer to the volcanoes to actually access the heat that's potentially available there, making them more difficult to develop than in Iceland. I thought I'd throw in a map of Canada as well. Probably my favorite area is really around Liard Hot Springs, which is sort of up there in the Northwest Territories, and a really fantastic geothermal area. What we're not going to talk about today, but I just wanted to mention quickly, because there's sometimes a lot of confusion between geothermal energy, what we traditionally consider geothermal energy, and things like ground source heat pumps. And this is a really interesting technology that's becoming more and more accessible, not just in temperate regions, but even in colder climates. And so ground source heat pumps, which can be organized in a variety of different configurations, is something that's really not tapping deep heat from the earth, but more seasonal fluctuations in ground temperature due to heat coming from the sun, being absorbed by the ground during the summer season, and then that can be tapped and used for usually just space heating. And so I just kind of wanted to mention that the Cold Climate Housing Research Center in Fairbanks has done a lot of work on these, sometimes in partnership with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. So there's a lot of information on that if folks are interested, in particular for cold climate applications. So going back to traditional geothermal, these are factors that are really important to understand in terms of kind of defining the potential generation capacity per unit cost. And so basically what I'm getting at with this is that although many geothermal resources might be technically possible to develop, these are factors that actually make them potentially the decision point as to whether they're actually economic to develop. So temperature is a big one. Hotter resources are generally better. You're going to have higher efficiency of the conversion, less parasitic loads, things like that. So high temperature is better. Flow rate. There are some geothermal resources, for example, in Southeast Alaska, where you have fairly high temperatures, but very minimal flow rates, fairly tight system. So you do need a certain volume of fluid as well. Looking at that sort of that reservoir framework, and this next one is sort of related to that, the recharge nature of the reservoir in the rock. So understanding, basically how much fluid can sort of be held in the rock body. It's not like there's empty voids underground. This fluid isn't being held in like some giant cavern underground, which sometimes when we look at pictures, we almost have that idea. It's really water that's moving through the rock matrix itself. And so there's some types of rock framework that are more conducive to that than others. Depth is a really big one. So, one common factor to think about is that, anywhere you drilled in the earth, if you drilled deep enough, you would access high temperatures. But there's really this point at which the cost of the drilling technology, the cost of potentially pumping fluid through the rock formation is such that you don't actually achieve savings. But this is kind of where things like improved drilling technology, lower cost drilling, looking at enhanced geothermal systems, there's really continued evolution and continued improvements that are important to understand and can kind of change the equation. And the last factor here is really the location. At least in Alaska, a lot of our best geothermal resources are not really co-located with population centers, and that really creates some challenges. We have some world-class geothermal resources potentially in the Aleutians, but those are pretty far away from population centers, from industrial loads, and that makes things challenging from an economic standpoint to develop those resources. So this is kind of, I guess, the slide I was sort of thinking about a little bit, is that, geothermal energy is sort of everywhere, but sometimes trying to capture useful work from that geothermal resources, like trying to extract gold from the ocean. There's, millions of tons of gold in the ocean, but it's so diffuse that trying to collect that is really cost prohibitive. And sometimes geothermal energy can be the same as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Chena Hot Springs. It's located in interior Alaska, and there's a few factors that made this a really ideal site for doing a low temperature geothermal project. The fluid temperature that we were working with was about 72 degrees Celsius, or about 165 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'll kind of describe some characteristics of Chena Hot Springs that made it a good site to develop. It's semi-remote, and I think this is actually a pretty important factor. It's not grid connected to the rest of Alaska. So it's it has a standalone autonomous microgrid that supports electric power generation at the site, which was provided 100% by diesel generator. And so what we were working against, or what our baseline cost was for power generation, was provided by diesel generators, where the diesel was imported from Fairbanks, about 60 miles away. And so the costs were much higher than you'll find in many other places. So that's something to keep in mind. So the electric power there was about 30 cents per kilowatt hour. The typical load there was between 180 kilowatts and 380 kilowatts, and about an average of $1,000 a day was spent on diesel fuel in 2004. So this is kind of when we were working on sort of defining this potential project. So at today's prices, that'd be about $500,000 a year in fuel costs. So it's fairly significant for this site. So the vision of the owners when I started working there, and I think it is really important to kind of capture the rationale for developing a particular project, whether that's for a community or an individual site like this. Their vision was to become a self-sustaining community as much as possible in terms of energy, food, heating, and fuel. And so that was really kind of their starting point, is not just how can we reduce our costs, but also how can we become as self-sufficient as possible. So geothermal bathing is something that had been done at this site for a long time. The geothermal resource was historically used for this, first by miners from Fairbanks, starting in about 1905. Interestingly, there's not a lot of archaeological evidence that, that Native Alaskans used this site historically, and I think part of the reason is that there's not a lot of good and obvious food resources in that area. It's fairly far away from salmon streams or caribou migration areas. We spent a lot of time looking at what our energy use at Chena Hot Springs is and how we could best meet that need. I think interestingly, and this is true for a lot of communities in the north, about 2/3 of the energy use at Chena Hot Springs is actually for heating, and a much smaller fraction, about 1/4, is for power generation. And then a few other factors like refrigeration and transportation also played into the mix, but heating was really the major load. And so using the geothermal energy first and foremost for space heating made a lot of sense. This is a fairly typical kind of use for application for low temperature, low enthalpy geothermal resources. But we also expanded that pretty quickly to food production, because that was one of the goals of the owners of the site, is to try to grow as much local food as possible. Because it gets very cold here in the winter, it typically gets well below -40 Celsius or Fahrenheit. It's difficult sometimes to grow things. The sun is below the horizon about 3 months of the year because it's down in a valley, very cold spot. But we were able to use the geothermal resource in this initial really simple greenhouse that we put up with the University of Alaska Fairbanks to grow tomatoes and lettuce, some really basic crops. It actually got to -65 Fahrenheit during the winter on one day, and we were able to keep the interior of the greenhouse at 70 Fahrenheit. So that was great that we were able to demonstrate we could do that. There's also other projects that we did. So geothermal was not the solution to everything. We actually incorporated some fairly old technologies. In this case, we used a water ram pump to pump water from upstream of the geothermal site, because the salts, the saline solution, the saline geothermal water was not healthy for the plants. And so we actually went upstream, pumped water using a water ram into a holding tank, and then used that to water the greenhouse and gardens that we had developed. And so after developing that small greenhouse, we then went and expanded that into a much larger production greenhouse with a fair amount of investment of local resources. And so that's still operating today, using a hydroponic system for both lettuce production and tomatoes, which are the two crops that, that the resort has chosen to focus most of their attention on. And using energy efficient lighting has been a major component of that. So even though they are using geothermal power, they're trying to keep their overall energy budget as low as possible, and using LED lighting with the proper spectrum for things like lettuce has been really important and a major sort of research focus area. So the greenhouses were completed in 2006, approximately about 5,000 square feet of growing area, 30 kilowatts for the lighting, number of different crops, and harvested, a fair amount that was primarily used for the restaurant and also selling to customers. I'm going to skip through this pretty quick just in the interest of time, but we also did some other kind of fun projects. This is an example of one that was a little more of a demonstration project using funding from the Department of Energy, where we actually the National Science Foundation, where we used excess power from the power plant at night to generate hydrogen, about 6 kilograms of hydrogen. We mixed that with the propane stream that was used for clothes drying and cooking and things like that. That was the purpose of this project. The mixed fuel had the same kind of safety characteristics as propane. It was still heavier than air, and so we were able to use that as a direct substitute, and we actually ran some grills for cooking and things like that off of this. This was kind of a demonstration project. It's not still operational. Another application for geothermal energy is, ironically, it's a great way to provide cooling. And I actually think that this is something that is an application that could be adopted a lot more broadly. The resort had this ice museum, ice hotel that they had constructed. and has a number of different sculptures in it. Fairbanks has some of the top ice sculptors anywhere in the world. We have the World Ice Art Championships in Fairbanks every year. And so there's this desire to have a year-round facility where people could practice their craft, hold classes, and our visitors, summer visitors, could have a chance to enjoy this kind of art. And so this is sort of an overview of the bar. You can go have an ice martini and an ice glass that's carved there. And it's been a pretty popular visitor attraction. We actually cooled this using hot water in an absorption refrigeration cycle. For those of you that are not that familiar with absorption refrigeration, it's the type of refrigerator that you might find in a camper or an RV, where you might run that off of propane with a heat source to drive the refrigeration cycle rather than using electric power. So in this case, we used as the heat source the geothermal fluid, and then we used as a cold sink this fluid from the creek that was adjacent to the ice museum. And so we were able to use that in this absorption refrigeration cycle to provide about 15 tons of refrigeration to this ice museum using kind of a plate freezer design. And although in this case we're keeping it cold, using hot water for the purpose of sort of a tourist destination, there's no reason why this same kind of process wouldn't work for food preservation or anything like that. And I also want to mention that there's no reason why it needs to be necessarily a geothermal heat source. One of our communities in Western Alaska, Kotzebue, used a really similar absorption chiller, which was actually installed prior to the one at Chena Hot Springs, to use heat from their diesel power plant during the summer months when there wasn't a need for space heating, and used that to make ice, like actually ice cubes that the fishermen could use to take out on their boats and ice the fish after they caught it, so they had a higher quality product and were able to sell it at market for a higher price. So a lot of these things I'm talking about, even though I'm talking about geothermal energy, there's applications for these sorts of things for any kind of like low quality waste heat resource, and there's a lot more of those available out there than sometimes we realize. So with the power plant, what we did there is we actually chose a kind of a slightly different approach to generating power. When you have a high temperature geothermal system, you can use a steam generator, which is sort of typical, ubiquitous for many sorts of power applications. When you have a lower temperature resource, you need to, that's not hot enough for water to boil and generate steam, you need to basically figure out a way to use some other working fluid that you can boil into a vapor and use that vapor to drive the turbine in the place of steam. Now, a lot of these power plants traditionally have been built as one of sort of machines, and we couldn't really find a manufacturer that was willing to do one for the sorts of low temperatures that we had available to us. So we wound up working with United Technologies Research Center to kind of reverse engineer a refrigeration system. So with most refrigeration systems, when you think about it, and I'm talking about a typical one that you plug into the wall that's an electric refrigerator, what you do is you have electric power that comes in and it runs your cycle, and it creates an area inside your refrigerator that's cold and an area in the back by those coils behind your refrigerator that's hot. And so instead, we again have this area of cold available. In the case of Alaska, we have very good cold resources, whether that's water or air. And then we have this hot geothermal resource, and then we run the system backwards and produce electric power. And that's essentially the way this system functioned, is a refrigerator running in reverse. I'm just going to run through these really quickly. I think that we can make these slides available later. And there's also a number of papers. If you just kind of do a search online, you'll be able to find a number of papers on exactly how this system works. But there's nothing really special about it other than to say that we used a very specific refrigerant, R134A, that had specific characteristics that work for this particular temperature. And so essentially, you have the cooling water coming in. I'll show a layout of the site really quickly that condenses that refrigerant back down into a liquid, and then a pump kind of starts the cycle over again. So we drilled a couple of different wells. We drilled a production well, and then we also drilled a injection well where we re-injected at least a portion of the geothermal fluid. I think that's another thing that's important to understand, is that it's important to balance the geothermal resource, and if you're pulling water, extracting it from that resource, it's also important to replace that fluid, or you're going to start having degradation, especially of both the pressure and the temperature of that reservoir over time. The other thing that we did is we actually have this from the right side of the screen, there's this blue line that's here, and that's actually a cold water resource. We actually siphoned water out of what we called an infiltration gallery into the cooling part of the power plant. So it actually didn't require any water. It was about 1,000 liters per second, maybe about 3,000 gallons per minute of cold water that was just siphoned. It was just a siphon that we set up. There was about 20 or 30 feet of drop along that route, and that really helped make this project possible because we didn't have a lot of parasitic load on the cooling side. Here's a picture of the original power plant. One of these units is decommissioned today, but they've installed a new unit from Kaishan, which is a Chinese manufacturer of organic wrecking cycles. So the original plant was 400 kilowatts. It uses about 30 liters per second of that 72 or 165 Fahrenheit fluid. It's both air and water cooled, air in the winter and water in the summer, as I described earlier, and reduced the local costs to about 5 cents. The total project cost was about 2.2 million, which is actually fairly low, but part of the advantage was that we used a lot of recycled materials and repurposed pipelines and things like that from other projects. And it's got a pretty low thermal efficiency, which is important to understand. This is where things like parasitic loads that can really come in. But that kind of low thermal efficiency would be totally unacceptable in something like a power plant, a geothermal, like a diesel power plant. But it works here because you're essentially not paying for the fuel. The fuel is essentially free. I want to mention too, this isn't the first geothermal power plant that was installed in Alaska. Kind of just a fun little fact that Ormat actually installed a 5 kilowatt ORC organic Rankine cycle. Is the cycle that I just described in terms of this binary cycle that's typically used for low temperature geothermal. And this actually operated at Manly Hot Springs, kind of northwest of Fairbanks in the late 1970s. So here's a couple of pictures from that installation. And Ormat actually went on to, they've captured the majority of the market share for ORC, organic Rankine cycle, or binary plant manufacturers around the world. So, so they got their start in Alaska. This is a little bit of research I did while I was working as a Fulbright scholar in Iceland. We were interested in sort of looking at the evolution of this industry and these organic Rankine cycle devices. And so I've got a couple different examples. Svartsengi is another power plant in Iceland that uses these ORCs, these binary devices for kind of a bottoming cycle after the fluid goes through their higher temperature cycle. And so those were installed back in about 1998. Husavik was another project, slightly different cycle, but similar sort of concept, that was installed in about 2001. And then Chena's not on here, but it was installed in about 2006. And we were really able to bring the costs of these down, and this idea of being able to use equipment that kind of came off of an assembly line rather than being built one of kind of purpose built seems to have really kind of accelerated the number of manufacturers and the number of technologies and projects that have been developed. So you can see that the red parts of the line are all geothermal, but these same sort of cycles can be used for biomass or heat recovery, or even in some cases for solar. So here's some examples of some of the current ORC products and manufacturers that are out there, just kind of looking at some of the general costs. Not all of these, actually there's been some changes in this as well. This is data that's a couple of years old now, but you can see that there's quite a number of different manufacturers on the market and different products that are out there that can be used for these applications today, which is pretty exciting. And again, just kind of mentioning that this isn't just an application for geothermal energy, but low temperature thermal energy that's available from a number of different purposes. So one thing that in Alaska has been of real interest is looking at applications related to waste heat recovered from diesel engines and using that for additional power generation. So that's one thing that we've worked with some of our utilities on. Unalaska is one example of that. Ironically, they also have a good geothermal resource nearby, but in this particular case, they used one of these ORC units from a different manufacturer, from Electratherm, which is a US manufacturer, for waste heat recovery in conjunction with their diesel power plant. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. And I think that's all I have, actually. So Carolyn, maybe I'll turn it over to you for leading some Q&A.
Great, thank you, Gwen. So folks tuned in, you can submit questions via the Q&A box at your control bar at the bottom of the page. We have one that came in from Danny Miguel Revilla Vargas, who says, who asks, how much is the cost of a heat pump? Could it be possible to get an example of a 23 kilowatt, for 23 kilowatts of heating power system?
Okay, so is the question, and I'm sorry, I'm not able to read it. So are you asking about a heat pump, or is this related to like an organic Rankine cycle system? Can you tell?
So I think the question came in during, like, shortly after your slide on heat pumps, but I'll give Danny a minute to respond to that follow-up question.
Yeah, because if we are talking about heat pumps, you know, I'm not really, I don't feel like I could tell you exactly right now what the cost points are for those, and a lot of that also has to do, going back to that question around efficiency. It really depends a lot on sort of your ground temperature, your ambient air temperature, what sort of coefficient of efficiency you can get from those kinds of systems. So to some extent, there's a little bit of site-specific nature to that. And I do think that if people are interested in that question, researching that or going to the Cold Climate Housing Research Center or sending me an email, you see my email address on the screen right now, I'd be happy to connect you with the right people to answer those questions.
Okay, great. Looks like Danny was interested specifically in heat pumps. So check out CCHRC. Next question comes from Philip White, who asks, what is the feasibility of using geothermal resources within Fairbanks city limits to provide district heat?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And, you know, so Fairbanks is a, you know, community here in interior Alaska for some of our international participants. And, you know, we already have a district heat system that is set up here. It's currently run off of heat from a coal-fired power plant. So we already have the infrastructure in place for something like that. And geothermal heat is used for city heating in a number of different cities, both in the U.S., like in Boise, Idaho would be an example, and then places like Reykjavik, but also a surprising number of cities around the world do tap into geothermal heat. The challenge with Fairbanks specifically is that we don't necessarily have the right sort of rock there. When I talked about that reservoir framework and that need to have a reservoir framework that can move fluid freely and mine heat from the earth, Fairbanks is not really ideally set up for that because of the type of rock that we have. And secondly, we don't have anything more than an average geothermal gradient. And so drilling to access high temperatures in Fairbanks, we would actually have to drill quite deep because we have a very typical or average geothermal gradient. And so I'm hoping that someday the technology is going to mature to the point where geothermal is available over a really large geographic area. And there's a lot of people working on, you know, what's considered to be engineering or enhanced geothermal systems, EGS. And so someday, you know, I think that would be a possibility. But right now, I think that the economics and the type of reservoir framework we have wouldn't support that.
Great. The next question we have is from William Harvey, who asks, what year was the Kaishen unit installed and what year was one of the PC units decommissioned?
I think that those happened somewhat concurrently, and I believe that that was in about 2010. That's my best guess. So it was approximately 4 years after the original power plant was operational. And one of the things to think about is the materials that you use in these kinds of geothermal power cycles. There's real challenges sometimes with certain materials. The geothermal fluid can be pretty aggressive, like it often has, some sulfur in it, things like this that can create issues. And so in this case, they had used, as this demonstration original plant, tubes that had copper in them as a component, and those did not hold up to the geothermal fluid. And so they basically decommissioned one of the units, replaced the tubes in the other, and then installed this Kaishan unit, which has been operating. The other thing is that the Kaishan unit is capable of actually being a standalone generation system. So the Chena, the original power plant, it was set up where it needed a existing grid that it could sync to that could synchronize to. It couldn't form a power grid on its own. So it still relied on the diesel generator to provide kind of baseload power, and then it replaced a big chunk of the actual amount of kilowatts that were used, but it still required a diesel generator to form the grid, whereas the Kaishan system could be a standalone unit if it could meet the entire demand of the site.
All right, next question comes from Carlos Pais, who asks, could you give us some information on cold modules and cold storage manufacturers on the market or in the market?
Yeah, I mean, the one that we worked with, and I really like this company, is called Energy Concepts. They're based out of Annapolis, Maryland. And so they have, some off-the-shelf products. They have really good engineers, and they've worked across a whole range of different technologies. They've used these absorption chillers in conjunction with solar applications, as well as geothermal, waste heat. And they have a really nice kind of compact product. I'm sure that there are other manufacturers out there, but what was nice about them is that they've been around a long time, they know what they're doing, but they're still small enough that they can do some fairly specific engineering for individual projects as well.
All right, another question from Carlos. Do you run or have any sort of training or learning on hand at the site at Chena Hot Springs?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, actually. And that was that was one of the things that for me was a real significant challenge when I started working out there, is that it was very, very hard to find good information and good mentorship for these kinds of projects. The geothermal community is fairly small, but at what I was doing was kind of a little bit unique, and it was really hard to kind of get the information I needed. What my recommendation on that is that we've actually been working with Iceland a bit to develop a program that we call the Arctic Remote Energy Network Academy, or the Alaska Remote Energy Network Academy. And what we're really trying to do with that program is connect people that are interested in a particular technology or project that has relevance to Alaska, or that we have some experience in, with the right network of people to help them develop their project. And that actually grows out of a program from Iceland called the Geothermal University. And they do a really good job there. It's called the Geothermal Training Program in Iceland. It's a United Nations university program, and they accept about 20 applicants from around the world a year. And if you're able to get into that program, they do a really fantastic job. Iceland has focused a little bit more traditionally on higher temperature resources, but that's definitely an option. But the Arctic Remote Energy Network Academy would be a really excellent opportunity to really connect you with Chena Hot Springs, with the engineers and the technologists and the resource folks that kind of helped make that project possible, along with a number of other projects from around the world. People that were working on that team have worked quite a bit in Chile and South America, as well as in Africa, on different geothermal resources. So it was a good team, and we're happy to make those connections. If Carlos wants to email me directly, I'd be happy to help him link up with the resources that he needs.
Great. And if you're interested in more information about the ARENA program, you can also find a link on our ACEP website to ARENA. We're working on the 2020 update, so there will be more program information forthcoming. But the information you'll find there is from the 2017 pilot program. The next question comes from Christopher Vesflug. I'm sorry if I butcher anyone's names. I apologize for my lazy tongue. For developing low temperature geothermal resources, is it possible to exhaust the geothermal resource in the region? Are there other environmental consequences of developing these geothermal resources?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I'm really glad that he asked that. And the answer is, geothermal resources are kind of not an infinite resource, and we can't really think of them that way. There's sort of, when you have a geothermal resource, maybe that's centered around a hot springs like this, you have sort of this natural amount of heat loss to the surface that's occurring at some sort of a sustainable rate over, often millions of years, or at least, tens of thousands of years, where this geothermal resource has kind of reached some sort of a steady state. And theoretically, that the heat is being replenished at the same rate that it's being lost once it's reached that steady state. And if you continue to extract heat at that exact same amount, you should be able to kind of maintain that sort of steady state scenario where you've got the heat that's coming in and being lost perfectly balanced. But what we usually do with these geothermal sites is that we overproduce the fluid. We're extracting heat at a higher rate than what is naturally occurring. And so you will see decline over periods of time in temperature and in terms of pressures in the reservoir. And so this is kind of where it's really important to think about long-term management of that geothermal resource, because you want to protect it to the greatest extent possible. And especially like those pressure declines, we don't think about that too much. But for example, when that power plant at Chena Hot Springs is being actively operated, the natural hot springs there go dormant. They are not visible at the surface anymore. You don't have any more surface expression of the geothermal resource there. And so what they do instead is we basically put some of the effluent from the power plant back into the hot springs pool to kind of keep the pools there and available for people to benefit from. But the actual springs go dormant. As soon as you turn off the power plant, they pop right back up. You get kind of that reservoir pressure back. But over time, that continues to decline. And so that's just something you really need to think about. Like, you can't extract some infinite amount of energy, of water, of fluid from a resource. You really need to balance that with where you're putting the water back in, where you're maintaining that pressure, and you're taking really good care of that reservoir over time. And that's a really key part to designing a good geothermal system.
Next question comes from Carlos, who asks, where can we get more information specifically on cold generation?
Oh, on absorption refrigeration? I don't know, Carolyn, what the possible avenues for this is. There's definitely papers that I've helped co-author on that particular project, for example, that I'm happy to share, or we could post it, or you can probably find it online. If you Googled my name, absorption refrigeration, Chena Hot Springs, or energy concepts, or any combination of that, you will almost surely kind of trip across some of the conference papers or presentations we put together on absorption refrigeration. And then the Alaska Center for Energy and Power has written a number of much more comprehensive reports related to some of that testing that we did, looking at using that sort of cycle off of waste heat recovered from a diesel generator. So you can find those on our website if you go to the publications page and again, just start doing some searches on absorption refrigeration. I do really think that that for me is one of the most exciting possible applications in general, because we all have need for kind of cooling, especially of like food or produce, things like that. And so that's something that I'm pretty interested in continuing to do more work on. We have a researcher at the University of Alaska Fairbanks at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power that's actively working on absorption refrigeration for cold storage using recovered heat. And so if that's something he's specifically interested in, or anyone else on the call is specifically interested in, I'd encourage you to reach out and we can connect you with that researcher. His name is Dave Denkenberger. And we'd be very interested in finding collaborators to look at possible new applications for that technology.
Great. Next question comes from Soren, who asks, who's in charge with Pratt & Whitney organic Rankine cycle machine? It's difficult to find out a contact of those guys since they change the owners all the time. I'm looking for an application that uses water associated with oil and gas producing.
Yeah, that's actually a really, I didn't mention that before, but that's actually another really good possible source for geothermal fluid, or fluid that's been heated by the earth. Is a lot of the oil and gas wells that we have, oil wells in particular, they're often drilled to depths, and there's often good reservoir pressures associated with that, where the oil is often, coming out of the ground at not too dissimilar temperatures from what we found at Chena Hot Springs. And so there's the possibility of extracting that fluid and using that for on-site power generation as part of the production process. And there's been a lot of interest in that. I think a system was tested a few years ago in Idaho. But anyway, the question was specific about Pratt & Whitney or United Technologies. And so they actually sold that particular technology. It's called the PureCycle 200 or 280. They sold that, I think, to Mitsubishi. And so as far as I know, they focused more on the larger size units. So they're not really doing kind of these smaller size systems right now. I don't believe that that's like actually an active product. I don't even think that was on my product list here. Let me just go back and look at it one more time. Yeah, these are sort of the main companies that have production units today that are below about 300 kilowatts in size or so. And then there are some that are above that size as well. So I'm not sure that there is a current version of the PureCycle product, but I do know where you could buy a used one if you're interested in it.
Right. Next question comes from Christopher. You mentioned that it may not always be desirable to develop low temperature geothermal resources due to economic costs. Thinking of northern Saskatchewan that has remote communities similar to Chena, are there times when it is worth pursuing these very low temperature geothermal options?
I think that one of the factors related to geothermal that's kind of important to understand is that although sometimes you'll find a blind geothermal system that's sort of truly not really visible, there's no surface expression at the surface, there's definitely plenty of those systems out there. But they're really associated with fairly like specific geologic sort of formations. And I'm not a geologist, so I can't speak specifically to that. I know there's been a couple that have been found and ultimately developed mainly in Nevada in the US. And there's also examples of geothermal systems that have been developed where you have sort of where you're creating artificial fractures and fissures within the rock. I think one of the questions earlier that I didn't completely answer is whether there's other potential negative impacts related to geothermal. And one of those can be, you can see some shifting or subsiding or, small earthquakes or things like that. And that's just something that, again, like the industry is trying to get a better handle on and understand. I don't think there's ever been anything too traumatic that's happened, but that's just something to kind of keep in mind. In a place like northern Saskatchewan, where there's not a clear surface expression of a resource, and there's no reason to necessarily think for geologic reasons that there would be a blind geothermal system, you know, the thing to do first is to look at some really low temperature exploration technologies, maybe even collect some data in any deeper water wells that exist out there and see if you can establish whether there is any sort of a geothermal system that might be worth tapping into. I just kind of want to mention as a cautionary tale, there was a community in rural Alaska that wanted to drill, and even though there wasn't a clear surface expression for that, they wound up drilling a quite deep well, spent a huge amount of money on it, and were never able to actually produce the geothermal energy, and their cost of energy for their community went up by about 10 cents a kilowatt hour because of the costs associated with that project. And so I think it's really important to do the science first, to make sure that you have some reason to believe that you may have a viable geothermal resource and that it's worth doing some further investigation. I do think that in northern Saskatchewan, you know, there's about 5 gajillion lakes and things like that, and there's some real opportunity there potentially for doing more with, for example, ground source heat pumps, but using water source. So lakes are an awesome place that kind of can hold thermal energy over long periods of time. And so that you could potentially take advantage of some of that to use a lake as the heat source instead of the ground, and use that for space heating. And that might be a much more viable application in some of the northern communities in Saskatchewan.
Next question comes from Elizabeth. How does the location of where the geothermal potential is highest versus the population centers affect proposals for developing the resource further, i.e. power generation?
So basically can you read that one more time? I'm sorry.
Yeah. How does the location of where the geothermal potential is highest versus the population centers affect proposals for developing the resource further?
I mean, I think that that's kind of a hard question to answer. You know, I think that there are some of these areas, like for example, in Alaska, some of these remote geothermal sites that have some real potential if there was possibly an interested industrial client, or, you know, if the fish processing industry was able to invest in something like that. But it's just kind of a really tricky thing to kind of figure that out, because often sort of a chicken and egg problem. When you have something like a geothermal power plant, and a lot of renewables fall in this category too, you have really high upfront capital costs. And so figuring out a way to amortize that over some long period of time can be pretty challenging if you don't have anyone that's willing to sign on to a long-term power purchase agreement. And especially in Alaska, that's been sort of a challenge, because a lot of the industry that might be obvious candidates, like the seafood processing industry, which is, you know, fairly widely distributed in some of these remote areas, they don't have a lot of certainty in terms of their future. Especially related to some of these climate change issues. They're seeing a lot of change in the fish population and distribution, and they are not willing to sign on to long-term power purchase contracts. And I think even in places like Iceland, where you may have see some geothermal resources that have been developed in somewhat remote areas, or hydropower resources to power specific industrial loads over, you know, 20 or 30 year power contracts, you know, sometimes there's a lot of question about, you know, what's really the best value, who's receiving the benefit, you know, is it the local population, is it the industry, are there jobs being created? And these are fairly complicated questions, and a lot of them are pretty site specific, so I don't know that I can comment more than that.
Okay, great. Carlos follows up asking, are you dehydrating food or vegetables at Chena?
No, so the temperatures really are not high enough to do those kinds of different process technologies. There's a really great kind of diagram of the different temperatures that geothermal is ideally suited for, or any kind of, again, kind of heat application. But at Chena Hot Springs, those really mild temperatures aren't really adequate for things like food drying and things like that. So that wasn't something that we focused on.
Next question comes from Philip White. Are there examples of piping low temperature geothermal heat over short to medium range distances? Clearly the economics become marginal, but is it technically feasible to move low temperature geothermal heat over distances of say 40 to 60 miles?
Well, I mean, there's plenty of examples of, well, I don't know if plenty might not be quite the right word, but there are examples of geothermal fluid being piped for fairly long distances. I mean, I think the most well-known example is in Iceland, where the fluid that's used to heat a good part of downtown Reykjavik is piped from, I don't know, like maybe 30 kilometers away or something like that, but it's still much higher temperature. You know, what we talk about as being a low or moderate temperature resource means really different things to lots of people. I'm often kind of even hesitant to kind of use that term. But you know, in Iceland, those temperatures are quite a lot higher than what we see at Chena Hot Springs, and they're piping it a very long distance and only seeing like a temperature decrease of about a half a degree or something like that over that distance, a fairly small amount, maybe 1 degree or something. And at Chena Hot Springs, we piped the fluid from the wellhead to the power plant over a distance of about a quarter mile. And over that distance, we only saw a really modest temperature drop too in an insulated pipe of about maybe at also about a half a degree or a quarter degree. And so because you have a fairly high volume of fluid, you don't necessarily see a really large temperature drop over those kinds of distances, but it kind of comes back down to the economics. You know, how much quality of heat do you have? And so when you don't have a really high quality, a really high temperature resource to start with, you need more fluid to provide the same benefit on the other end. So that means you need a bigger pipe maybe, or higher pressure pumps or something like that. And so the economics, it's sort of this, you know, constant sort of losing battle. I mean, I'll give one example. There was actually a really excellent geothermal resource in Western Alaska that we were hoping to develop for the community of Nome, but unfortunately it was about 50 miles away from the community, and ultimately the cost of either building a transmission line or a pipeline wasn't really possible. And the other thing is too, if you're piping the geothermal fluid to another location, you're not able to replace that water in the reservoir, which means that you're going to see a much faster decline in that reservoir. You need to know that you have quite a lot of fluid that you can actually extract without replacing it, because generally speaking, you want to replace that used spent fluid. And you're probably not going to pipe fluid 2 directions, 40 kilometers or something like that. So there's a lot of things to think about there.
Next question comes from William Harvey. Oh, it's not a question. He's chiming in our conversation earlier. He says, TICA Thermal Solution now owns both the PureCycle and Exergy.
Okay, Exergy too. Okay, yeah, thank you for chiming in on that. I actually wasn't aware of that. That's good to know.
Another question from Soren, or following up from an earlier conversation. So we have hundreds of oil wells, but lack of business plans for geothermal applications. If you can recommend, yes, I'm interested in buying looks like it kind of dropped off there, but I think you were maybe making mention of the used system.
Yes, yeah. There's basically a brand new system that was installed in a waste heat application, and the utility no longer actually has a use for the equipment. So yeah, I don't actually know if they're interested in offloading that, but I can definitely connect them with those folks if he's interested. Yeah. What was the other part of that question?
No, I think that was it. So he's
Okay.
looking for, yeah, it sounds like he's interested in a secondhand purchase.
Perfect.
Maybe a
You
good
can
follow-up
serve as like
conversation.
the Craigslist of webinars here today.
So David Evans asks, a recent ACEP report established the potential for 2 MW electric power from Pilgrim Hot Springs. What is the status of developing that resource and getting it to the users in Nome?
Yeah, so that's actually exactly the project I was just referencing earlier today. We actually established that resource was capable of producing more than 2 megawatts. It was more around maybe 5 megawatts or so. But this is a perfect example of where on the other end, you've got a community whose baseload energy needs are a certain defined amount. And in this case, 2 megawatts was really what we established the utility could accept or purchase from this geothermal site without causing a significant amount of increasing costs for them. They already have a fairly good sized wind farm. So they'd get to the point where they'd probably need to add some energy storage or something like that. The real nice thing about geothermal energy, it has the potential to really replace the diesel generator and provide that sort of base load power that you can't necessarily count on with a variable renewable resource like wind or solar energy. So there were some real advantages there. But what wound up happening ultimately is that the cost of diesel came down significantly. It's really come down and been much more affordable in recent years. And so there was a much lower sense of urgency on the point of the utility to continue to drive forward with that development project. And the project was really marginal at best to start with because the cost of the transmission line is so high. These are these little sort of these technologies that are supportive technologies that can often make or break a project. The cost of transmission line, the cost of drilling, the cost of energy storage. These are kinds of separate sort of ancillary factors that can really make or break a particular project. And in this case, the cost of transmission was just too high. If that resource, if you could just pick it up and move it, 30 miles closer to Nome, it would have already been developed. So that's sort of the frustrating thing.
Next question comes from Carlos, who asks, Chena Hot Springs takes advantage of the cascade effect of the geothermal source. Could you give us an overview of the flow of the geothermal temperature through their processes from the well to the wastewater? Do you have knowledge of other similar projects?
Yeah, that's actually a super great question, and that's a really astute observation. And that's one of the things that's so neat about geothermal energy is that you can kind of really prioritize these different uses and use that same energy stream, that same water stream for like multiple different purposes until you either re-inject it or you discharge it to the environment. And so like in that particular case at Chena, the first and most the best use of the resource, well, I don't know if best might not quite be the right word, but the cycle that we needed the highest temperatures for was the power cycle. So that was the priority. So that was kind of the first entry point for most of the geothermal fluid. The absorption refrigeration cycle also requires fairly high temperatures, but not very much flow rate. It really was only using about 50 gallons a minute. So we often diverted or used a slightly different source for the fluid for the absorption refrigeration to power plant. Both use those high temperature resources. Then it went through space heating in the various buildings and the greenhouse system. So that was like about 20 degrees lower, 15 degrees lower Celsius or Fahrenheit, in temperature. By the time it was exhausted from there, it was quite a bit cooler. And then some of that effluent went into the pool, as I mentioned, into the bathing facility and was used there, and then discharged naturally into the environment at about the same rate that the hot springs would otherwise naturally have discharged to. So a lot of the bathers don't even realize that it wasn't coming from the hot springs. It was actually kind of coming from the power plant, just like the Blue Lagoon in Iceland also does a similar sort of thing. And then the remaining fluid was pumped back underground in a re-injection well to kind of try to maintain that reservoir pressure. And they played around with a lot of different wells and well completions to kind of make sure that that fluid is going to the same kind of reservoir underground, but not where it's short circuiting too quickly and coming right back up again. So that whole design of a geothermal system, it's hard to see under the surface and understand how the plumbing works. And so it really takes people with some real experience and specialized knowledge in that area. And I think Carlos was asking some really good questions earlier about, how do you gain that knowledge, or who do you figure out how to work with? And I'm really happy to help anyone with like specific questions about that, because it did take me a really long time to figure those things out myself.
Great. Carlos has another question here about, do you have any knowledge of water circulation pump manufacturers that handle 60 to 80 degree water?
I'm assuming he's talking Celsius here in terms of the temperatures that he's referencing. That's a really good question. And you do need to use specialized pumps. It depends, you have a couple different options when it comes to pumps. At those temperatures, you can actually use pumps that you can actually deploy in the wellhead. So you have like a pump actually in the well. At higher temperatures, it's often makes more sense to have the pump be at the surface of the well. But I don't really have any specific recommendations on manufacturers other than that he's already on the right track. You do really need to pay attention to that. And it's not just about that it can handle the temperatures, because a lot of times oil equipment can handle those sorts of higher temperatures. And so there's a lot of crossover between oil and gas equipment and equipment used in the geothermal industry. But the slight difference is sort of, again, like that the different minerals and dissolved stuff in geothermal water can create additional reactions with certain metals and things like that. So you have to be especially kind of vigilant about those kinds of issues, as well as like dissolved gases that are coming out of solution as you reduce the pressure on the wellhead. There's a lot of different factors associated with that, but there's some really good some really good folks that understand those sorts of like how to actually size and characterize a pump. So again, if he has, I'm happy to connect him with folks that have more expertise on that and that have helped me make those decisions.
So I think we had a follow-up from Danny's initial question. It sounds like he got heat pump sort of switched around with electricity generation. So he was looking for an approximate cost of generating, 23 kilowatts in a heating power system.
Okay.
Through geothermal.
Well, so I'm just going to go back to this slide here again. And so one of the big things is that there's not a lot of manufacturers, although they're increasing, but there's not, this is kind of the sort of technology that it doesn't necessarily scale down that easily, because, and that's sort of more on the turbine side of the technology. The system at Chena Hot Springs, that original system used a turbine kind of system, but some of the smaller ones are using like essentially a compressor screw expander, and that seems to work better at the slightly smaller sizes. These are, again, some of these different products that are out there, and I am not going to recommend any of them. I will say that Electratherm is probably the one that I'm most familiar with personally on this list. And they, have these systems in the 35, 65, 110 kilowatt range. So it shows you the cost per kilowatt hour. That's based on the 65 kilowatt unit that they have. Again, I'm not speaking with certainty that this is a current price. My guess is that these are a little bit outdated, but about $1,800 a kilowatt. So you can figure out what the cost for the equipment is. You can't multiply that times 23 in your case. You would have to buy, either the 35 or the 65 kW unit. If you have lower temperature, you're going to need the larger system to produce less electricity, because you'll be at a lower thermal efficiency. And so in that particular case, my guess is that you probably need to buy the 65 kilowatt system, depending on what your temperatures are. Electratherm and probably some of these others have good information on their website about, you know, really how much power they can generate at what output. And actually that report that I referenced that the Alaska Center for Energy and Power did, that's on our website, actually tested it out at various, you know, temperatures and flow rates to actually get some real power generation curves.
Great. Well, thank you, Gwen. Before shutting down, don't forget to keep an eye out for that survey that will be populating in your browser. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to email Gwen directly, or if you have questions about where you can find the recording or future webinars, you can email acepwebinars@gmail.com, and I will put you in touch with future webinar information. Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you.